My mother lied in court claiming I abandoned her and forced me to pay $3,500 monthly in alimony. The process server knocked on my apartment door on a gray Thursday afternoon in March, when the light rain was turning the entire city into a foggy mirror reflecting the growing melancholy that I didn't yet know was about to completely dominate my existence for the next endless months. It was exactly 16 minutes past 4 o'clock, a time that became permanently engraved in my memory as the precise moment when my carefully constructed life over 38 years of hard work, family dedication, and absolute honesty instantly crumbled before my still confused eyes about what was really happening. The shrill sound of the doorbell cut through the comfortable silence of my living room, where I was reviewing financial reports from the accounting consulting firm I had run for 7 years, with an impeccable reputation in the business market, serving clients who blindly trusted my professional competence and unquestionable ethical integrity that I had meticulously cultivated over decades of my career. When I opened the heavy, varnished wooden door that I had personally chosen 3 years earlier during the complete apartment renovation, I found a tall man dressed in a discreet navy blue suit, carrying a black leather briefcase worn from constant use, filled with official documents that gleamed threateningly under the artificial light of the hallway. Marco Silva Costa, a process server credentialed by the state court for over 10 years, had that neutral and impersonal expression characteristic of professionals who had turned the delivery of personal tragedies into automated bureaucratic routine, as if they were delivering ordinary mail instead of sentences that destroy entire lives in timed seconds. Mrs. Beatriz Fernandez Oliveira, my name is Marco Silva Costa. I'm a process server from the regional court, and I'm here to deliver a judicial summons regarding case number 2024/05/3479822, where you appear as defendant in an action for alimentary obligation filed by Helena Fernandez de Oliveira, your mother, requesting monthly alimony in the amount of $3,500 due to alleged material and emotional abandonment. He said in a monotone voice that transformed devastating words into mere procedural formality, consulting his papers while I remained completely paralyzed at the door of my own apartment. My 38 years of responsible existence dedicated to family seemed to have become completely irrelevant before those absurd words that instantly transformed my secure reality into an unfounded criminal accusation. Throughout my conscious adult life, I maintained a close and attentive relationship with Helena, visiting her religiously every Sunday without exception, bringing bags full of monthly groceries that included everything from hygiene products to special foods for her restrictive diet due to chronic health problems, paying for private medical appointments when the public health system failed miserably, and especially offering constant emotional companionship through daily phone calls that frequently lasted over an entire hour, talking about trivial everyday matters that kept her emotionally connected with the family she claimed to love above anything in the universe. The sensation was exactly like receiving a violent blow to the stomach while sleeping peacefully. I instantly woke up to a legal nightmare that would become my reality for the next devastating months of legal battles, humiliating investigations, and complete reconstruction of my understanding of who my biological mother really was. Officer, there must be a very serious administrative error, some completely absurd bureaucratic confusion, because I never abandoned my mother under any circumstances. Quite the contrary. I visit her weekly, bringing everything she needs, and she spends entire periods talking to me on the phone daily. I managed to respond with a trembling voice that came from my throat, constricted by the growing anxiety that was beginning to dominate every cell of my tense body. But the officer just handed me a yellowed copy of the official stamped documents and explained with professional bureaucratic patience that I had exactly 20 calendar days to present a formal defense in court, or I would automatically be considered in default and sentenced to pay the requested alimony indefinitely until the death of the plaintiff. The weight of the documents in my trembling hands seemed disproportionate to the cheap paper on which they were printed. There was my sentence of public humiliation described in cold legal terms that transformed decades of genuine family dedication into criminal abandonment through completely fabricated allegations. When the officer finally withdrew from my apartment, walking slowly down the hallway to the elevator that would take him back to the rainy city streets, I felt as if a fundamental part of my identity as a dedicated daughter had been violently ripped from my chest, leaving a painful void that pulsed synchronized with each accelerated beat of my confused heart. I ran desperately into the apartment, stumbling on the Persian rug that decorated the entrance, and immediately turned on my cell phone with fingers that trembled so violently I had to enter the unlock code 3 consecutive times before I could finally access the contact list to call Rodrigo, my 42-year-old husband who worked as a civil engineer at construction sites scattered throughout the metropolitan region of the city. "Rodrigo, you need to come home immediately. Something completely insane has happened that I'm not even able to process mentally," I said as soon as he answered the call after 2 long rings, my voice alternating erratically between growing panic and absolute indignation. "I just received a judicial summons saying that my mother is suing me for abandonment and asking for $3,500 monthly in alimony. It's completely absurd, surreal, impossible to believe that she would be capable of doing something so monstrous after everything I've always done for her for entire decades. Rodrigo, always calm and rational even during dramatic family crises, promised to leave the construction site immediately and arrive home within 40 minutes depending on the city's chaotic traffic, asking me to breathe deeply and try to stay calm until he arrived so we could analyze together that completely incomprehensible situation. The first thing I did after hanging up the call was meticulously reread every line, every paragraph, every specific allegation contained in the judicial documents that the officer had delivered, desperately searching to find some obvious factual error that could explain that monstrous misunderstanding as simple administrative confusion between people with the same names. What I found in the official papers made me feel as if the solid floor of my apartment had literally disappeared beneath my feet, leaving me falling in free fall through an abyss of unfathomable family betrayal. Helena had registered with social services a formal sworn statement affirming that I had not visited her for over 2 consecutive years, that I never contributed financially to her basic survival needs, that she lived in conditions of absolute misery without resources to buy food or essential medicines, and especially that I had deliberately cut all emotional contact with her, transforming her into an elderly woman abandoned by her own ungrateful daughter. The specific dates mentioned in the lawsuit were all meticulously documented with official social services records that supposedly had visited Helena's residence to verify her living conditions and confirmed the allegations of serious family abandonment. My social security number was absolutely correct in the documents. My date of birth was perfect. My complete residential address was exactly as it should be. My profession as an accounting consultant was precisely described, but the allegations about my behavior as a daughter were so completely opposite to factual reality that I felt as if I were reading about the life of a completely different person who happened to have my name in documents. It was as if Helena had created a parallel fictional narrative about our family relationship, transforming decades of genuine care into cruel abandonment through lies so elaborate and detailed that they convinced public officials trained to identify legitimate cases of family neglect. I picked up my cell phone again with hands that still trembled uncontrollably and called Helena directly, anxiously hoping she would answer and could provide me with some rational and logical explanation for that completely absurd situation that had transformed my ordinary Thursday into a devastating family tragedy. After 6 interminable rings that seemed to last individual eternities, she finally answered with that soft and affectionate voice I had known since childhood, the same voice that consoled me during nighttime nightmares when I was 5 years old and woke up frightened by imaginary monsters. "Dear daughter, what a nice surprise to receive your call in the middle of the afternoon. Usually you only call me after work. Did something special happen?" she said with a genuinely affectionate tone that contrasted dramatically with the devastating accusations she had officially registered against me in the judicial system. "Mom, I just received a judicial summons saying that you're suing me for abandonment and asking for $3,500 monthly alimony. I need you to explain to me immediately what's happening, because I know there must be some terrible misunderstanding," I said directly, keeping my voice firm despite the emotional hurricane that was devastating my interior. The embarrassing silence that followed my direct question lasted long enough for me to clearly hear the beats of my own heart accelerating progressively, echoing in my ears like war drums announcing a family battle I still didn't fully understand. When Helena finally broke the tense silence after approximately 15 seconds that seemed like 15 entire minutes, her voice had completely changed in tone. The maternal affection had instantly disappeared, replaced by calculated coldness I had never heard before in 4 decades of conversations between mother and daughter. "Beatrice, do you really think you can visit me once a week, bringing some cheap grocery bags, and think that compensates for decades of emotional neglect?" She responded with a voice that mixed accusation and victimization in a toxic combination that left me completely stunned. "You built your successful professional life, married a man with money, live in a luxurious apartment while your mother survives on a miserable retirement that barely pays the basic bills. I always thought you should contribute financially significantly to my maintenance, but since you never offered spontaneously, I needed to seek my legal rights through justice. Her words were so completely distorted from factual reality that I felt as if I were talking to a stranger who had kidnapped my mother's personality and replaced her with a professional manipulator. Mom, you know perfectly well that I visit you religiously every Sunday. I bring your monthly groceries that include everything you need. I pay for your expensive medicines when necessary. I take you to private medical appointments. I talk to you daily on the phone for over an hour. How can you say I abandoned or emotionally neglected you? I questioned, trying to appeal to factual logic against a clearly fabricated emotional narrative. Helena continued her performance as a misunderstood victim with impressive theatrical skill that revealed years of practice in sophisticated psychological manipulation. She claimed that my weekly visits were minimum obligation, that didn't compensate for her deep emotional loneliness, that the groceries I brought were insufficient compared to my professional income, and especially that I should contribute financially substantially because she had sacrificed everything to raise me alone after my father passed away when I was only 12 years old. The phone conversation extended for almost 40 minutes of circular arguments where Helena strategically alternated between dramatic victimization and veiled accusations, consistently refusing to admit that she had deliberately lied to government authorities about our real family relationship. Each time I presented concrete factual evidence about my constant dedication as an attentive daughter, she diverted the subject to subjective emotional issues impossible to quantify or prove objectively, claiming to feel emotionally abandoned, despite frequent contact, or stating that quantity of time together didn't compensate for supposed inferior quality of our interactions. Gradually, I began to perceive through her calculated evasions and sudden subject changes whenever I mentioned the specific lies registered in the lawsuit that this had not been an impulsive action motivated by genuine financial need, but rather a meticulously orchestrated plan to extort money from me through judicial blackmail based on completely fabricated allegations of family abandonment. I hung up the call with Helena feeling as if I had just talked to a complete stranger who had stolen my mother's voice and replaced it with a distorted and unrecognizable version that used familiar words to communicate messages completely alien to the values I believed she possessed. My hands were still trembling violently as I held the cell phone that seemed to have suddenly become heavier, as if the physical weight of the device had increased proportionally to the gravity of the devastating revelations I had just received through that disturbing phone conversation. Rodrigo arrived home exactly 47 minutes after my desperate call. Finding me sitting on the living room sofa, surrounded by piles of judicial documents scattered on the coffee table, like evidence of a crime impossible to fully understand, my face still wet from tears that had descended continuously during that entire interminable afternoon that seemed to have lasted entire weeks compressed into a few torturous hours. Beatrice, what exactly is happening? You seemed completely desperate on the phone, and now I see you like this, surrounded by all these official papers with court stamps, said Rodrigo, dropping his work briefcase on the floor and immediately sitting next to me on the sofa. Wrapping my shoulders with his strong arm in an attempt to offer physical comfort that contrasted dramatically with the emotional chaos that completely dominated my fragmented mind. During the next 30 uninterrupted minutes, I reported in detail every aspect of the Kafkaesque situation that had invaded my life that afternoon. The process server's visit delivering a judicial summons based on completely fabricated allegations of family abandonment. The accusations officially registered with social services alleging I hadn't visited Helena in years, when in reality I visited her religiously every week. And especially the disturbing phone conversation where she had revealed without any apparent shame that she considered my weekly visits and all the financial support I regularly provided as insufficient, compared to what she believed she deserved based on subjective emotional criteria impossible to quantify objectively. Rodrigo listened attentively to every word of my narrative without interrupting me once, his expression gradually transforming from initial concern to growing indignation as he mentally processed the magnitude of the maternal betrayal being revealed through documentary evidence and reports about conversations that clearly demonstrated calculated psychological manipulation instead of genuine confusion about our real family relationship. Beatrice. This isn't just a family misunderstanding that can be resolved through frank conversations. This is potentially judicial fraud based on false statements registered with government agencies, he observed after I finished my complete explanation, picking up some of the official documents and carefully reading the specific allegations that Helena had formally made about our relationship. Your mother registered a sworn statement affirming completely false facts that can be easily refuted through concrete evidence such as bank transfer records, dated photographs of weekly visits, phone call history, and especially testimonies from neighbors and family members who know perfectly well the reality of our family relationship. Rodrigo's technical observation about the potentially criminal nature of Helena's actions made me realize for the first time that this wasn't simply an emotionally needy mother asking for more attention from her children through inadequate official channels, but rather a deliberately constructed strategy to extort money from me through the judicial system using false allegations of abandonment as a tool of institutionalized legal blackmail. Rodrigo, during the phone call, she showed absolutely no shame or regret for having lied to government authorities about our relationship. Quite the contrary. She defended her lies as if they were legitimate emotional truths, just because she felt she deserved more attention, and especially more money than I was voluntarily providing, I explained, recalling the specific details of the conversation that revealed a fundamental disconnection between objective factual reality and distorted subjective emotional perception. She claimed that my weekly visits were minimum obligation that didn't compensate for her loneliness, that the monthly groceries I bring were insufficient compared to my professional income, and especially that I should contribute financially substantially simply because she raised me alone after my father passed away. Rodrigo remained in thoughtful silence for a few moments, clearly processing all the legal and emotional implications of that complex situation that transformed family relationship into a potentially devastating judicial dispute for everyone involved. Beatrice, we need to act quickly and strategically, because you only have 20 calendar days to present a formal defense in court, and during that period we need to gather all possible evidence that unequivocally proves that Helena's allegations are completely false, he said, already entering the practical problem-solving mode that characterized his professional approach to complex situations. I'm going to call my cousin lawyer, who specializes in family law right now, to schedule an urgent consultation still this week. And meanwhile, you need to start meticulously documenting every aspect of your real relationship with Helena during the last few years, including specific dates of visits, amounts of bank transfers, phone call records, and especially testimonies from people who can testify about the factual reality of the situation. The mention of concrete evidence immediately reminded me of something that could be crucial to refute Helena's absurd allegations. I had maintained for the last 3 years a meticulous habit of photographing our weekly visits, especially during special occasions like birthdays and important holidays, creating an extensive digital archive that visually documented our close and constant family relationship through hundreds of images automatically dated by the metadata of digital photographs. Rodrigo, I have literally hundreds of dated photographs of my weekly visits to Helena's house during the last few years, including recent images from just 2 weeks ago when I brought the monthly groceries and we spent the entire afternoon talking about the renovation she wants to do in the bathroom, I said, feeling a wave of initial relief realizing I possessed irrefutable visual evidence that directly contradicted the allegations registered in the lawsuit. Besides that, I have all the bank receipts of monthly transfers I regularly make to help with extra expenses, receipts for expensive medications I buy for her, and especially the complete history of phone calls from my cell phone showing we talk daily for periods that frequently exceed an entire hour. While Rodrigo called his cousin lawyer urgently explaining our situation and requesting an emergency meeting to discuss defense strategies, I immediately began systematically organizing all the digital evidence I had stored on various electronic devices scattered around the house. I opened my personal laptop and navigated to the family photos folder, where I kept all visual documentation of my relationship with Helena organized, discovering with growing satisfaction that I had over 400 dated photographs covering a period of approximately 3 consecutive years, all clearly showing our close and constant family interaction that absolutely contradicted the abandonment allegations registered in the lawsuit. Each photograph was a small victory against the false narrative Helena had constructed. Images of Sunday lunches we prepared together in her kitchen, photographs of walks we occasionally took in city parks, visual records of birthday celebrations where I was always present with carefully chosen gifts, and especially dozens of casual selfies we took during our weekly conversations that demonstrated genuine affection and real emotional closeness. In addition to the photographs, I began systematically compiling all financial records that proved my constant contribution to Helena's material well-being. Monthly bank transfers that totaled significant amounts over the years, digitized receipts for specific medications she needed for chronic health conditions, proof of payment for private medical appointments when the public system failed, and especially detailed records of the monthly groceries I religiously brought, including specific products she requested based on her dietary preferences and particular household needs. Each financial document was concrete evidence that contradicted the allegations that I never materially contributed to her basic needs. transforming her narrative of financial abandonment into an easily refutable lie through simple verification of official bank records that no court could ignore or dismiss as mere subjective perception. Rodrigo finished the phone call with his cousin lawyer and informed me that we had managed to schedule an urgent meeting for the following Friday morning at his office located in the city center, where we would discuss the entire situation in detail and develop a comprehensive legal strategy to refute the false accusations and potentially sue Helena for defamation and judicial fraud, depending on the specialized legal advice we would receive. Dr. Mendez said that cases like this are unfortunately becoming more common in recent years, with elderly parents using the judicial system to extort financially successful children through exaggerated or completely fabricated allegations of family neglect. Rodrigo explained, revealing a disturbing reality about how family relationships were increasingly being transformed into judicial disputes, motivated by financial interests instead of genuine needs for protection of vulnerable elderly people. The following night was one of the longest and emotionally exhausting I had experienced in my entire adult life, dominated by persistent insomnia, caused by obsessive thoughts that circulated infinitely through my agitated mind, without finding satisfactory resolution or clear understanding of how Helena had reached the point of transforming our maternal relationship into a judicial dispute based on deliberate lies. I remained awake until approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, lying in bed next to Rodrigo, who slept deeply, my mind compulsively revisiting every memory I had of my relationship with Helena during the last decades, desperately searching for signs I might have missed, clues that could have alerted me to her capacity to distort factual reality to fit emotional narratives that justified manipulative behaviors, intended to extract financial resources through psychological or legal blackmail. Had there always been some tendency in Helena to dramatize everyday situations, transforming small inconveniences into disproportionate tragedies that demanded excessive attention and especially constant emotional validation from people around her? Were there historical patterns of subtle manipulation that I had ignored or excused as harmless personality characteristics instead of recognizing them as warning signs of deeper manipulative tendencies? During those solitary hours of nighttime vigil, I began systematically remembering specific incidents from the past that at the time had seemed merely irritating eccentricities, but that now, illuminated by the current revelation of her deliberate judicial lies, acquired more sinister meanings as possible examples of long-standing manipulative patterns that I simply hadn't recognized as problematic. I remembered occasions during my adolescence when Helena used subtle emotional blackmail to get me to do things I preferred to avoid, claiming that truly loving daughters wouldn't refuse reasonable requests from mothers who had sacrificed so much to raise them alone after becoming widowed early. I recalled episodes during my young adulthood when she repeatedly compared my successful professional life with her chronic financial difficulties, implicitly suggesting I had a moral obligation to compensate for economic disparities between our situations through substantial financial contributions that went beyond occasional assistance with extraordinary expenses. I remembered conversations where she casually mentioned friends of hers whose children supposedly were more financially generous, using social comparisons as a psychological pressure tool intended to make me feel guilty for not providing more extensive financial support voluntarily. All these historical incidents that I had previously interpreted as normal characteristics of relationship between mother and adult daughter now revealed themselves as possible components of a long-standing manipulative pattern that had culminated in the decision to formally register false allegations through the judicial system when her informal attempts at psychological pressure had not produced financial results she considered adequate. The gradual perception of this historical pattern was simultaneously enlightening and devastating. Enlightening because it finally provided understandable context for seemingly inexplicable current behavior, but devastating because it meant accepting that Helena had possibly been manipulative for entire decades of our maternal relationship. And I simply hadn't recognized or consciously admitted this disturbing reality because it fundamentally conflicted with my idealized image of who she supposedly was as a loving and dedicated mother. The meeting with Dr. Mendez happened as scheduled on the cold and cloudy Friday morning, at a law office located on the 12th floor of a modern commercial building in the busy city center, with large windows offering a panoramic view of the urban landscape that extended to the distant horizon where skyscrapers gradually gave way to lower residential buildings and finally to green suburban areas. Dr. Mendez, a criminal attorney and family law specialist with 57 years of accumulated professional experience, received us in an elegantly decorated conference room with mahogany shelves filled with leather, bound law books, and framed diplomas attesting to decades of successful legal practice in complex cases involving emotionally charged family disputes. He was a medium-height man with gray hair meticulously combed back, wearing an impeccably cut dark gray suit that conveyed professional authority without excessive arrogance, and especially possessed that rare combination of rigorous technical competence and genuine human empathy that characterizes truly exceptional lawyers who understand that legal cases always involve real people suffering emotionally devastating situations. Mrs. Beatrice, Rodrigo briefly explained to me on the phone yesterday the general nature of the situation you are facing, but I would now like you to report to me in detail all relevant aspects of the case, starting from the moment you received the judicial summons until the conversations you had with your mother after discovering the accusations registered in the lawsuit, said Dr. Mendez, preparing his electronic tablet to take digital notes during my narrative. During the next 45 consecutive minutes, I meticulously reported every detail of the discovery of the false allegations, the delivery of the summons by the process server, my careful review of the documents that revealed specific accusations of abandonment that completely contradicted the factual reality of our relationship, the disturbing phone call to Helena where she had defended her lies as legitimate emotional truths, and especially my growing perception through retrospective analysis of historical incidents that suggested a long-standing manipulative pattern I hadn't consciously recognized during decades of maternal relationship. Dr. Mendez listened attentively to my entire narrative while taking extensive notes on his tablet, occasionally interrupting to ask clarifying questions about specific dates, exact financial amounts, and especially about documentary evidence I possessed to refute the allegations registered in the lawsuit. When I finished my complete report, he remained in thoughtful silence for a few moments, clearly processing all the information and mentally formulating appropriate legal strategy to defend my interests while potentially exposing Helena to legal consequences for judicial fraud, depending on the severity of the lies she had formally registered with government agencies. Mrs. Beatrice, based on what you just reported and the documentary evidence you possess, I believe we have an extremely strong case not only to completely refute the abandonment accusations, but also to potentially sue your mother for defamation, procedural fraud, and misuse of the judicial system for financial extortion purposes. He declared with professional conviction that immediately provided me with a significant sense of relief. The fact that you possess hundreds of dated photographs documenting constant weekly visits during consecutive years, combined with bank records proving regular financial transfers and payments for medical expenses, creates irrefutable evidence that absolutely contradicts the allegations registered with social services that you haven't visited or financially contributed to your mother for over 2 years, continued Dr. Mendez, his technical analysis transforming my chaotic anxiety into structured understanding of how we would proceed legally. Furthermore, the phone call history showing daily prolonged conversations unequivocally demonstrates that there is no emotional abandonment as alleged in the lawsuit. And especially the phone conversation where your mother admitted she considers your weekly visits insufficient, clearly reveals that the accusations are not based on real abandonment but rather on unmet financial expectations she is trying to impose through judicial coercion. Dr. Mendez's legal analysis of the fundamental weaknesses in Helena's case provided me the first moment of genuine hope since I had received that devastating judicial summons 24 hours earlier, transforming the sensation of victim helplessness into recognition that I possessed substantial legal resources to defend myself effectively and potentially completely reverse the situation against whoever had initiated that unfounded judicial attack. Dr. Mendez, besides refuting her accusations, is there legal possibility of holding her criminally responsible for having deliberately lied to government authorities? I asked, feeling for the first time a complex mixture of righteous indignation and deep sadness, considering the possibility that my own mother could face serious legal consequences for her conscious manipulative choices. Dr. Mendez adjusted his reading glasses before responding with professional seriousness that indicated the gravity of the situation. Yes, Mrs. Beatrice, registering false statements with government agencies, especially with the purpose of obtaining financial benefits through a judicial process, constitutes a crime of procedural fraud and possibly fraud depending on specific circumstances. And based on the evidence you possess, there would be solid grounds to file a criminal complaint against your mother if you decided to follow that legal path. The mention of possible criminal consequences for Helena made me confront for the first time the devastating reality that defending my own legitimate rights could result in my own biological mother facing criminal investigation and potentially even judicial conviction that could include severe financial penalties or even prison sentence depending on how seriously the judicial system treated procedural frauds committed against children by manipulative parents. Dr. Mendez, I understand I have legal rights I need to defend, but the idea of potentially sending my own mother to prison or causing devastating legal consequences for her leaves me emotionally conflicted, because despite everything, she is still my biological mother who raised me for decades, I honestly confessed, revealing deep emotional ambivalence that characterized my impossible situation, where defending my own legitimate interests necessarily meant attacking a person with whom I shared family ties of entire decades. Dr. Mendez demonstrated genuine understanding of my emotional conflict through an empathetic facial expression before responding with professional wisdom, accumulated through decades dealing with similar cases where family relationships transformed into devastating judicial disputes. Mrs. Beatriz, I perfectly understand your emotional conflict, and it is absolutely normal to feel ambivalence about defending your rights when that can cause negative consequences for a family member, but you need to carefully consider that your mother made a conscious choice to judicially attack you through deliberate lies. And allowing these lies to prosper without consequences only encourages continuation of manipulative behaviors and establishes a dangerous precedent where family can commit fraud against family without facing appropriate accountability. Dr. Mendez's words resonated deeply with the rational part of my mind that logically recognized I hadn't created that conflictive situation, but merely was responding defensively to an unjustified judicial attack, deliberately initiated by Helena. But simultaneously, my emotional heart still resisted the idea of transforming a family dispute into a legal battle that could result in permanently devastating consequences for a maternal relationship that, despite being clearly dysfunctional, still possessed decades of shared history, including many genuinely positive moments I valued deeply. For now, I suggest we first focus on presenting a robust defense that completely refutes her accusations through the irrefutable evidence you possess. And only after evaluating how she responds to our defense will we decide if it is appropriate or necessary to escalate to a criminal complaint for procedural fraud, proposed Dr. Mendez, offering a pragmatic middle path that would allow me to defend my rights effectively while keeping doors open for possible less conflictive resolution if Helena demonstrated some willingness to reconsider her actions after confronting concrete evidence that completely demolished her fabricated narrative of family abandonment. During the 3 days following that initial meeting with Dr. Mendez, I obsessively dedicated myself to the task of compiling exhaustive documentation of every aspect of my real relationship with Helena during the last 5 consecutive years, creating a comprehensive dossier that included not only dated photographs and financial records, but also written testimonies from her neighbors who witnessed my regular weekly visits. Confirmations from Claudia, my older sister, about our real family dynamics, including detailed descriptions of how I had always been a dedicated and attentive daughter, and especially detailed chronological analysis demonstrating that on each specific date mentioned in the lawsuit where Helena claimed to be abandoned, I possessed documentary evidence proving I had visited her or spoken extensively on the phone on those exact days. Each additional document I discovered or created added another layer of irrefutable evidence that transformed an apparently he said, she said case into objective and unquestionable demonstration that Helena had deliberately lied to government authorities with clear intention of financially extorting me through institutionalized judicial coercion. Claudia, my 43-year-old sister who lived in a different city located approximately 125 miles away but maintained regular phone contact with me and occasionally visited during important holidays, reacted with absolute incredulity when I called to inform her about the lawsuit Helena had initiated against me, based on completely fabricated allegations of family abandonment. Beatrice, this is completely insane. Everyone in the family knows perfectly well that you're the most dedicated daughter that exists. Visiting her religiously every Sunday, bringing monthly groceries, paying for private doctors when necessary, and especially maintaining constant emotional contact through daily calls that frequently last over an hour, exclaimed Claudia with genuine indignation after I explained in detail the entire Kafkaesque situation that had invaded my life during the last week. Honestly, I think Mom is having some kind of psychological crisis, or was badly influenced by someone external who convinced her she could get money through the judicial system, exploiting laws for vulnerable elderly people. because her behavior makes absolutely no sense considering the obvious reality of your close and attentive relationship with her. Claudia's hypothesis about possible external influence manipulating Helena to initiate fraudulent judicial process planted a seed of suspicion in my mind that quickly germinated into an increasingly convincing theory as I considered various recent circumstantial factors. In the last 6 months approximately, Helena had repeatedly mentioned during our phone conversations a new friend named Conceição, whom she had met in a social group for elderly people organized by the municipal government, and this friend supposedly had gone through a situation where she obtained substantial alimony from successful children through a similar judicial process based on allegations of family neglect. Was it possible that Conceição or other people in that social group were actively encouraging elderly people to initiate fraudulent lawsuits against their own children as a systematic strategy of institutionalized financial extortion, transforming legitimate laws intended to protect genuinely vulnerable elderly people into tools of judicial abuse for financial benefit of people who in reality received adequate care from their families? I shared my theory about possible external manipulative influence with Dr. Mendez during our second meeting, scheduled to review the complete documentation I had compiled, and he confirmed that unfortunately this pattern of behavior was becoming increasingly common in recent years, as ill-intentioned people discovered loopholes in the judicial system that allowed exploitation of elderly protection laws for purposes of financial extortion against economically successful children. There are even reports of unscrupulous lawyers who actively recruit elderly people in social groups, offering free legal services to initiate lawsuits against children alleging abandonment, with agreement that they will receive a substantial percentage of any alimony obtained through the process, revealed Dr. Mendez, exposing a disturbing reality about how a legal system intended to protect the vulnerable was being systematically abused by opportunists who transformed functional family relationships into lucrative judicial disputes based on completely fabricated allegations. The revelation about a possible organized judicial fraud scheme involving multiple elderly people being manipulated to sue their own children added an extra layer of complexity to my situation, because it meant Helena possibly wasn't the sole malicious architect of that judicial attack, but could be partially a victim of external manipulation, perpetrated by even more unscrupulous people exploiting emotional and financial vulnerabilities of lonely or financially insecure elderly people. This possibility significantly complicated my feelings about how to proceed, because if Helena was being manipulated by third parties, then confronting her only defensively through refutation of her accusations might not solve the underlying problem of external manipulative influence that would continue pressuring her to maintain the lawsuit even faced with irrefutable evidence that completely demolished her fabricated narrative. During the following Monday, exactly 8 days after receiving the initial judicial summons, Dr. Mendez formally presented to the court our comprehensive response to Helena's accusations, including extensive documentation that categorically refuted each specific allegation registered in the lawsuit through unquestionable objective evidence. Hundreds of chronologically dated photographs covering a period of 5 consecutive years, demonstrating constant weekly visits. Complete bank statements showing regular monthly financial transfers totaling substantial amounts over the years. Receipts for medications and medical appointments paid for. Detailed phone call history proving daily prolonged contact. And especially sworn testimonies from multiple witnesses, including Helena's neighbors, my sister Claudia, and even employees of the local supermarket where I regularly bought groceries that I brought to her during weekly visits. The judicial response that Dr. Mendez had prepared was not merely defensive, but assumed a strategic offensive posture by meticulously documenting not only that Helena's accusations were false, but that they constituted deliberate procedural fraud with clear intention of financial extortion through abuse of the judicial system intended to protect genuinely vulnerable elderly people. After officially filing our response with the court, it only remained to await Helena's reaction and her lawyers when they confronted irrefutable evidence that completely demolished the fabricated narrative she had registered with social services and subsequently in the lawsuit. Dr. Mendez predicted there were 3 possible likely scenarios. First, Helena could recognize that her allegations were unfounded and voluntarily withdraw the lawsuit before the formal hearing, thus avoiding public exposure of her lies and possible legal consequences for procedural fraud. Second, she could try to reformulate her allegations, transforming the accusation of total abandonment into a claim that the care she receives is insufficient compared to her real needs, changing strategy from easily refutable factual allegations to more difficult to objectively contradict subjective emotional arguments. Third, and most concerning, She could obstinately persist with the original allegations even faced with overwhelming contrary evidence, possibly because she was being pressured or manipulated by third parties who had financial interest in maintaining the lawsuit, regardless of the factual merits of the case. The following 2 weeks were a period of growing anxiety, where I constantly oscillated between hope that Helena would reconsider her actions after confronting irrefutable evidence and fear that the situation would escalate to a devastating public judicial confrontation that would permanently destroy any possibility of maintaining a functional family relationship, even if dysfunctional. During this anguishing waiting period, I continued maintaining my usual routine of visiting Helena every Sunday as I had always done, a conscious decision advised by Dr. Mendez as a way to demonstrate consistency of behavior and especially to document through additional photographs that my weekly visits continued unchanged even during the pendency of the lawsuit, further strengthening the argument that the abandonment allegations were completely disconnected from the factual reality of our relationship. The Sunday visits during this period were surreal and emotionally exhausting experiences because I needed to maintain an appearance of superficial normalcy while internally processing the devastating betrayal represented by the lawsuit based on deliberate lies that Helena had initiated against me. Helena, for her part, behaved during visits as if absolutely nothing was wrong between us, talking normally about trivial everyday matters, graciously accepting the groceries I brought, and especially never mentioning even obliquely the lawsuit she had initiated, as if there existed complete psychological compartmentalization between our weekly personal interaction and the institutionalized legal dispute running parallel through the judicial system. This apparent cognitive dissociation between normal interpersonal behavior during visits and officially formalized hostile judicial actions deeply disturbed me because it suggested either that Helena possessed an impressive capacity for conscious manipulation, maintaining a facade of normalcy while executing a calculated legal attack, or that she genuinely didn't understand the fundamental contradiction between officially alleging abandonment while continuing to receive weekly attentive visits from the daughter who supposedly had abandoned her. During the 3rd week after filing our robust judicial defense in court, I received an unexpected call from the law office representing Helena in the lawsuit, requesting an in-person meeting between all parties involved to discuss the possibility of an extrajudicial agreement that would avoid a formal public hearing and potentially serious legal consequences for everyone involved in the increasingly heated family dispute. The call was made by a legal assistant who identified herself as Patricia Suarez, speaking in a professional, neutral tone but carrying subtle nuances of urgency, suggesting Helena's side was recognizing the fundamental fragility of their allegations. After confronting the overwhelming mountain of documentary evidence, we had officially presented categorically refuting every aspect of her fabricated narrative about alleged family abandonment. Mrs. Beatriz, my name is Patricia Suarez. I work at the office that legally represents Helena Fernandez de Oliveira, and our attorney responsible for the case would like to propose an informal meeting between all parties before the date scheduled for the formal judicial hearing, with the objective of exploring possibilities for friendly resolution that benefits everyone involved, avoiding the emotional and financial wear of prolonged litigation through the judicial system. She explained with careful word choice that avoided explicitly admitting weaknesses in Helena's case, but clearly signaled willingness for negotiation that wouldn't exist if they genuinely trusted in the viability of their original allegations. Immediately after hanging up that surprising call, I contacted Dr. Mendez to inform him about the meeting proposal and request legal guidance on how to proceed strategically faced with that first concrete indication that the opposing side was reconsidering their initial position after carefully evaluating the overwhelming strength of the evidence demonstrating unequivocally the falsity of the accusations formally registered against me. Dr. Mendez responded with controlled but perceptible professional satisfaction, interpreting that contact initiative as implicit validation of his initial assessment that we possessed a legally unassailable case, and that Helena's lawyer had probably informed her about the substantial legal risks she would face if she persisted with a lawsuit based on demonstrably false allegations documented through fraud in official statements provided to government agencies. Mrs. Beatrice, this request for a meeting to discuss extrajudicial agreement is an excellent sign indicating that her side is recognizing the unsustainability of their original allegations after analyzing the irrefutable documentation we presented, categorically refuting every aspect of the abandonment narrative she had constructed, explained Dr. Mendez with a tone that balanced cautious optimism with experienced legal pragmatism. I suggest we accept participation in this meeting because it represents an opportunity to resolve the situation in a less conflictive way than a formal public hearing. But we need to enter this negotiation with a clear and firm position on minimum acceptable terms that completely protect your interests and establish appropriate consequences for the fraudulent behavior your mother demonstrated by deliberately registering false statements with government agencies. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning in a neutral conference room located in a judicial mediation building specialized in facilitating extrajudicial resolutions of complex family disputes before they escalated to formal judicial confrontations that frequently caused irreparable damage to interpersonal relationships that could potentially be preserved through negotiations facilitated by trained professional mediators. Rodrigo insisted on accompanying me to that crucial meeting not only as emotional support, but also as an additional witness to anything that was said or agreed during negotiations that could permanently define the future nature of my relationship with Helena, and especially establish precedents on how our family would deal with interpersonal conflicts involving financial disputes or emotional expectations not adequately satisfied through honest, direct communication. During the 3 days preceding that potentially decisive meeting, I constantly oscillated between cautious hope that Helena would finally recognize the gravity of her actions and demonstrate genuine remorse for having transformed a maternal relationship into a fraudulent judicial dispute, and realistic skepticism based on her dissociative performance during recent Sunday visits, where she continued acting as if absolutely nothing was wrong between us, despite the hostile judicial process running parallel through the legal system. I arrived at the judicial mediation building exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled time, accompanied by Rodrigo and Dr. Mendez, who carried a thick leather briefcase filled with organized copies of all the documentation we had compiled during previous weeks, unequivocally demonstrating the falsity of Helena's allegations. The building was modern construction with architecture deliberately designed to convey neutrality and professionalism through clean lines, soft colors in shades of gray and beige, an especially complete absence of symbols or decorations that could psychologically favor any side in disputes that were mediated in that institutional space dedicated to facilitating consensual resolutions of complex interpersonal conflicts. We were led by a judicial assistant to a large conference room on the 3rd floor. Equipped with a large oval table of light wood surrounded by comfortable ergonomic chairs, a sophisticated video conference system for cases involving remote participants, and especially large windows offering a calming view of an internal garden meticulously maintained with lush tropical plants and a small artificial lake that created a visually calming atmosphere deliberately designed to reduce emotional tensions that typically characterized meetings where families discussed financially or emotionally charged disputes. Helena was already present in the conference room when we arrived, sitting in one of the chairs on the opposite side of the oval table, accompanied by her lawyer who formally introduced himself as Dr. Paulo Cardoso, a man of approximately 60, 5 years with completely white hair and facial expression that mixed legal professionalism with visible discomfort, probably caused by growing recognition that he had accepted representing a client in a case based on demonstrably false allegations that placed him in an ethically compromising position before the judicial system and his professional peers. Helena completely avoided direct eye contact with me when I entered the room, keeping her gaze fixed on papers scattered on the table in front of her, her tense body and defensive posture revealing obvious nervousness that contrasted dramatically with the artificial confidence she had demonstrated during our recent phone conversations and Sunday visits, where she pretended everything was perfectly normal between us. Rodrigo sat to my right, positioning himself strategically as a symbolic physical barrier between me and Helena, while Dr. Mendez occupied the chair to my left, methodically organizing his documents on the table, preparing for the negotiation he had carefully planned during previous days, establishing minimum, non-negotiable terms that would completely protect my interests. The judicial mediator designated to facilitate that meeting entered the room exactly at 10 o'clock as scheduled, introducing himself as Dr. Ricardo Fernandez Silva, a forensic psychologist specialized in family conflict mediation with 20 years of professional experience helping families navigate emotionally complex disputes involving financial issues, unmet expectations, and especially dysfunctional communication patterns that transformed resolvable interpersonal problems into destructive legal battles that caused permanent damage to relationships that could potentially be preserved through appropriate therapeutic interventions combined with clear legal structures, establishing healthy boundaries and proportional consequences for manipulative or fraudulent behaviors. Dr. Ricardo was a medium-height man with slightly graying brown hair, wearing a light brown suit without tie that conveyed accessible professionalism without excessive formality, and especially possessed that calming presence characteristic of experienced therapists who had developed the ability to facilitate difficult conversations between emotionally activated people without taking sides or allowing discussions to escalate into destructive, unproductive confrontations. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone's presence here this morning to explore possibilities for consensual resolution of this family dispute before it advances to a formal judicial hearing that would inevitably cause significant emotional wear for everyone involved, regardless of the final legal outcome, began Dr. Ricardo with a voice carefully modulated designed to establish a collaborative rather than confrontational atmosphere. I understand through the preliminary documentation I received from the lawyers of both parties that there exists a fundamental dispute about the nature and adequacy of the current relationship between Mrs. Helena and her daughter, Mrs. Beatrice, with formally registered allegations of material and emotional abandonment that were subsequently contested through extensive documentary evidence, suggesting that the real relationship differs substantially from the description presented in the initial petition that originated this lawsuit. His words were carefully chosen to describe the situation in a technically neutral way, without explicitly accusing Helena of deliberately lying, but anyone with minimal comprehension capacity could detect in the lines that he had reviewed the evidence and recognize that the original allegations were fundamentally incompatible with the factual reality documented through dated photographs, financial records, communication histories, and multiple corroborating testimonies. Dr. Paulo's transparent attempt to completely reformulate the nature of the original allegations, transforming an accusation of total abandonment into a claim of insufficient assistance, left me simultaneously outraged by the obvious intellectual dishonesty and almost amused by the audacity of trying to rewrite documented reality through simple rhetorical reinterpretation of words that had been officially registered with specific, unequivocal legal meanings. Dr. Mendez clearly shared my reaction as evidenced by a facial expression that mixed professional incredulity with growing determination not to allow the opposing side to escape so easily from appropriate consequences for the procedural fraud Helena had committed by registering demonstrably false statements with government agencies with the explicit purpose of obtaining financial benefits through institutionalized judicial coercion. Dr. Paulo, with all respect to your impressive rhetorical skill, we cannot simply ignore or conveniently reinterpret facts unequivocally documented through irrefutable objective evidence, responded Dr. Mendez with a tone that balanced professional courtesy with absolute firmness on non-negotiable principles. Your client didn't simply register a statement expressing need for greater financial assistance, but specifically alleged under oath that my client hadn't visited her for over 2 consecutive years, that she never contributed financially to basic needs, and that she had deliberately cut all emotional contact. Allegations that were all demonstrated to be completely false through hundreds of dated photographs, bank records of regular monthly transfers, daily phone call history, and multiple testimonies from neighbors and family members confirming constant weekly visits. Dr. Mendez paused dramatically, allowing the weight of his words to settle completely before continuing with a statement that clearly established our negotiating position, and especially signaled that we would not accept resolution that simply allowed Helena to escape consequences without explicit recognition of her fraudulent actions and establishment of appropriate safeguards against future manipulative behaviors. Photographs don't lie, Dr. Paulo. Official bank records don't lie. Digital metadata doesn't lie. Multiple independent witnesses don't collectively conspire to fabricate an alternative narrative. Only people lie. And in this specific case, there is irrefutable documentation demonstrating that your client deliberately made false statements to government agencies with clear intention of obtaining financial benefits through fraudulent judicial process that would constitute a crime of fraud and procedural fraud if we decided to proceed with formal criminal complaint instead of exploring extrajudicial resolution. The tense silence that followed that emphatic declaration lasted approximately 10 seconds that seemed like an eternity, during which Helena finally raised her gaze from the table and looked at me directly for the first time since the beginning of that meeting, her light blue eyes revealing a complex mixture of emotions that included shame, fear, defensiveness, and especially something that could be interpreted as resentment for having been publicly exposed through irrefutable evidence that demolished the narrative she had carefully constructed, hoping I would simply passively accept false accusations out of fear of confronting my own biological mother. Dr. Ricardo, the judicial mediator, intervened at that moment of growing tension with professional skill, characteristic of experienced forensic psychologists who know exactly when to allow direct confrontations to develop naturally and when to strategically intervene to prevent unproductive escalation that could destroy possibilities for mutually acceptable consensual resolution. I believe everyone present recognizes there exists a significant discrepancy between allegations registered in the original petition and factual reality documented through extensive evidence presented by the defense. He said with obvious diplomatic care, avoiding using the word lie, but communicating essentially the same concept through a technically neutral professional euphemism. The relevant question for our meeting today is not to relitigate the factual merits of the case, but to explore if there exists a consensual path that allows resolving this dispute in a way that protects the legitimate interests of both parties while preserving, to the extent possible, the family relationship that clearly possesses significant history, despite current conflicts related to financial and emotional expectations, not adequately satisfied through honest direct communication before escalation to the judicial system. Rodrigo, who had remained silent, carefully observing interpersonal dynamics during the first half of that tense meeting, finally decided to contribute with an external perspective from someone who intimately knew our family relationship, but wasn't emotionally compromised in the same way I was with the psychological complexities of confronting maternal betrayal. With all respect to Dr. Ricardo's diplomatic efforts to facilitate consensual resolution, I need to express the perspective of someone who personally witnessed Beatrice's extraordinary dedication as an attentive daughter during the years I've known this family, said Rodrigo with a firm voice that carried controlled indignation clearly directed at Helena, who continued avoiding direct eye contact with anyone in the room. We're not here discussing simply a misunderstanding about appropriate amounts of family support or different interpretations of filial obligations, but rather responding to a deliberate judicial attack based on officially documented lies that could have completely ruined the professional reputation and financial stability of a person who dedicated decades of her adult life maintaining a close and attentive relationship with a mother who now demonstrated she was willing to destroy her daughter through legal fraud apparently motivated by financial greed or external manipulative influence. Rodrigo's direct and unvarnished words clearly discomforted Dr. Paulo, who immediately tried to redirect the conversation back to less confrontational ground, focused on future practical solutions, instead of recriminations about past behaviors that everyone present already implicitly recognized as problematic, even though Helena's side refused to explicitly admit the fraudulent nature of the original allegations. Mr. Rodrigo, I appreciate your perspective as a family observer of this situation, but perhaps it would be more productive if we focused our limited energy in this meeting on exploring potential terms of agreement that could satisfy Mrs. Helena's legitimate needs for greater financial security while simultaneously protecting Mrs. Beatrice against future disputes related to the same issues, he suggested with professional diplomacy that barely disguised the obvious urgency to move the conversation away from discussions about accountability for procedural fraud that placed his client in an extremely vulnerable legal position with potentially serious criminal consequences if we decided to proceed with formal complaint instead of accepting extrajudicially negotiated resolution. Dr. Mendez immediately responded to that attempt to divert the conversation by clearly establishing non-negotiable parameters that would need to be included in any extrajudicial agreement we would consider accepting as an alternative to proceeding with complete litigation, including possible criminal complaint against Helena for procedural fraud and embezzlement. Dr. Paulo, we are certainly willing to explore the possibility of extrajudicial resolution that avoids additional wear from formal public hearings, but any agreement we consider acceptable will need to include at minimum 3 non-negotiable components, he declared with absolute professional authority, establishing the framework for negotiation that completely protected my interests while offering Helena the opportunity to avoid potentially devastating criminal consequences. First, your client will need to formally and unconditionally withdraw all allegations registered in the current lawsuit, explicitly recognizing that abandonment accusations were factually incorrect and not based on the documented reality of the relationship she maintains with my client. Second, your client will need to sign a sworn statement permanently renouncing any future claim for alimony or mandatory financial support beyond what my client chooses to voluntarily provide according to her own personal discretion. Third, your client will need to agree to establishment of clear boundaries on future communications, including specific prohibition against making public or private allegations that defame the reputation or character of my client, under penalty of immediate legal actions for defamation and breach of extrajudicial agreement. The 3 terms presented by Dr. Mendez were simultaneously fair, from the standpoint of protecting my legitimate interests, and strategically designed to test the genuineness of Helena's willingness to take responsibility for her fraudulent actions versus simply seeking a convenient escape that would allow avoiding consequences without real recognition of the gravity of the behavior she had demonstrated by deliberately registering false statements with government agencies. Helena's reaction to those proposed terms would be revealing about whether she genuinely recognized the error of her actions and was willing to make appropriate reparations, or if she was simply trying to manipulate the mediation process as another tactic to avoid deserved consequences while maintaining the possibility of future similar attacks if the first attempt at judicial extortion didn't produce desired financial results. Heavy silence dominated the conference room for approximately 20 seconds after Dr. Mendez presented those non-negotiable terms, during which Helena exchanged significant looks with her lawyer, silently communicating something I couldn't completely interpret, but that clearly involved strategic evaluation of whether they should accept those relatively generous terms, considering the alternative of facing complete judicial process with real possibility of subsequent criminal complaint. Finally, to my absolute surprise, considering the dissociative behavior Helena had demonstrated during previous weeks, she spoke directly for the first time since the beginning of that meeting, her voice loaded with emotion that seemed genuine, but that I no longer completely trusted given her impressive performance, maintaining a facade of normalcy during Sunday visits while simultaneously proceeding with fraudulent judicial attack through parallel official channels. Beatrice, I need you to know that I never had real intention of harming you or causing damage to your reputation or financial stability. She began with tears visibly forming in her light blue eyes, an emotional performance that could have deeply moved me just a month ago, but that I now observed with cold analytical skepticism, seeking to detect signs of calculated manipulation versus genuine remorse. I know I made a terrible mistake by following advice from people who convinced me I had legal right to greater financial support from my children, and that the only path to achieve this would be through formal judicial process. But I swear I didn't fully understand I was making technically false allegations, because in my emotional heart I really felt abandoned, even though factually you visited regularly and contributed financially, as documents unequivocally prove. Helena's explanation was a textbook example of an attempt to reposition objectively fraudulent behavior as emotional misunderstanding, based on an artificial distinction between objective factual truth and subjective emotional truth, a common rhetorical strategy used by manipulators when confronted with irrefutable evidence of documented lies that cannot be credibly denied, but can potentially be recontextualized as legitimate expressions of internal feelings instead of deliberately false factual statements registered for purposes of financial gain through judicial coercion. A small but persistent part of me desperately wanted to believe that Helena genuinely hadn't understood the critical legal distinction between expressing personal feelings about perceived emotional inadequacy versus registering specific factual allegations about complete material abandonment that were demonstrably false through extensive documentation. But the larger and more rational part of my mind recognized that explanation was unlikely, considering the detailed specificity of the allegations she had officially registered, including specific technical statements about complete absence of visits during a period of 2 consecutive years and total lack of any financial contribution to basic needs. Before I could formulate an adequate response to that obvious attempt by Helena to recontextualize her deliberate lies as mere emotional misunderstanding, Dr. Mendez strategically intervened by clearly establishing that that revised narrative didn't fundamentally alter the fraudulent nature of the actions she had consciously executed, regardless of any underlying emotional motivations she might retroactively claim to justify objectively criminal behavior. Mrs. Helena, with all respect to your emotional difficulties, when you registered a sworn statement with a government agency specifically stating that your daughter hadn't visited you for over 2 years and never contributed financially to your basic needs, those were not vague expressions of subjective feelings, but specific factual allegations that you knew or should have known were demonstrably false, considering you received regular weekly visits photographically documented and monthly bank transfers officially registered. He declared with professional firmness that allowed no ambiguity about the legal distinction between expressing legitimate emotional dissatisfaction versus deliberately registering false factual statements with the purpose of obtaining financial benefits through the judicial system. Feeling emotionally abandoned despite regular contact is a legitimate feeling that could have been addressed through direct family communication or appropriate therapy, but transforming that subjective feeling into officially registered false factual allegations constitutes procedural fraud regardless of emotional motivations that may have influenced the decision to commit that crime. But I had finally reached a point where I needed to express directly to Helena exactly how her actions had fundamentally affected my perception of who she really was, versus who I had believed she was during decades of maternal relationship based on trust I now recognized as potentially illusory long before that specific judicial attack. Mom, I want you to understand something extremely important about why simply accepting your explanation of emotional misunderstanding is not sufficient for me. I began with a controlled voice but loaded with genuine emotion that had been repressed during weeks of needing to maintain professional composure during the process of compiling evidence and preparing legal defense. You didn't simply express a feeling of loneliness or emotional inadequacy to the social worker who visited your house. You deliberately constructed a detailed and specific narrative, alleging I hadn't visited you in 2 years, when in reality I had been in your house just days before that visit. You alleged you never received financial contribution when your own bank statement showed regular monthly transfers, and especially you maintained this farce for months while continuing to receive my weekly visits and accepting groceries and medicines I brought as if nothing was happening. I paused briefly, allowing the weight of my words to settle before continuing. This capacity for dissociation between factual reality and fabricated narrative is not simply emotional misunderstanding, but demonstration of conscious manipulation that makes me question how many other times during our relationship you deliberately distorted reality to get what you wanted through emotional blackmail or performative victimization. The silence that followed my statement was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of water running in the artificial lake of the internal garden, visible through the conference room windows. Helena finally seemed to understand that her habitual strategy of emotional manipulation would not work in that context because I had finally developed clarity about behavioral patterns that probably existed for a long time, but that I had consistently rationalized or ignored because I didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truth about the manipulative nature of fundamental aspects of our maternal relationship. Dr. Ricardo, the judicial mediator, gently intervened, trying to direct the conversation back to more productive territory, focused on practical resolution instead of emotional recriminations, that although understandable, wouldn't necessarily advance the negotiation process. Mrs. Beatriz, clearly there exists deep pain and fundamental breach of trust that will need to be processed over time, possibly with appropriate therapeutic support. But for purposes of this meeting, perhaps we can focus on establishing terms that legally protect you while allowing Mrs. Helena to avoid criminal consequences that would be devastating for her at this stage of life. The final agreement was formally drafted by Dr. Ricardo, incorporating all negotiated terms and especially establishing specific penalties if Helena violated any aspect of the agreement, including a substantial financial fine for each violation, and especially automatic reestablishment of my right to file criminal complaint for the original crimes without statute of limitations. When the moment came to sign that legal document that would effectively end the lawsuit but also permanently establish a new nature of my relationship with Helena based on clear boundaries instead of naive trust, I felt a complex mixture of relief at avoiding prolongation of public legal battle and deep sadness at definitively recognizing that the maternal relationship I had valued for decades had been fundamentally transformed by revelation of her capacity for manipulation and fraud that probably always existed, but that I had managed to ignore until it manifested in such unequivocally destructive form through that fraudulent judicial attack. Helena signed the documents with visibly trembling hands, her pale face and defeated expression revealing that she finally understood she had lost not only the lawsuit, but especially the trust and respect of the daughter who had always been dedicated and attentive, but who would now establish future relationship based on caution and clearly defined boundaries instead of emotional openness and unconditional generosity. When all documents were finally signed and appropriately witnessed by the judicial mediator, I stood up from the chair preparing to leave that conference room and symbolically close that traumatic chapter of my family life. Helena tried one last time to establish some kind of emotional connection. Beatrice, I hope that with time you can eventually forgive me and we can rebuild some version of the relationship we had before all this happened, she said with a small and hopeful voice. I stopped briefly before responding with careful honesty that balanced human compassion with realism about the impossibility of returning to the confident naivety that had characterized our previous relationship. Helena, forgiveness is a complex process that requires time and especially genuine behavioral change, consistently demonstrated over years and not weeks or months. And as for rebuilding the relationship we had before, that will never be possible because that relationship was founded on trust that you deliberately destroyed through conscious choices to betray me in the most devastating way imaginable. I left that judicial mediation building feeling a strange combination of legal closure and emotional opening of wounds that would need much time to heal appropriately through continued therapy, and especially through gradual reconstruction of my capacity to trust in human relationships without developing destructive cynicism or paranoia that would harm my ability to form genuine connections with people who deserved trust based on consistent behavior demonstrated over time. Rodrigo silently held my hand as we walked back to our car parked in the building's underground garage, his constant presence and unconditional support during those difficult months serving as living evidence that there existed people capable of genuine loyalty and love that manifested through protective actions instead of empty words or calculated emotional manipulations. The following 6 months were dedicated intensively to deep therapeutic process, with a psychologist specialized in relational trauma and trust reconstruction after significant family betrayals, working systematically to process not only the specific betrayal represented by the fraudulent lawsuit, but also painful retrospective recognition that manipulative patterns had probably existed for decades of our maternal relationship. But I had consistently rationalized or minimized because I didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truth about dysfunctional aspects of family dynamics I had accepted as normal, simply because it was the only reality I had known since childhood. Dr. Mariana Costa, a forensic psychologist specialized in complex family traumas, helped me develop a conceptual framework to understand how emotional manipulators frequently combine genuinely loving behaviors with manipulative tactics, creating psychological confusion that makes it difficult for victims to recognize problematic patterns because real positive experiences coexist with destructive manipulations instead of being a clear situation of obvious constant abuse. Beatriz, it's important to understand that your mother probably genuinely loves you within the limitations of her emotional capacity, but she also possesses deeply rooted manipulative patterns that she uses when she feels her needs are not being adequately satisfied, explained Dr. Mariana during one of our particularly revealing weekly sessions. This duality doesn't mean the love was completely false, but it means the love was conditional and mixed with manipulative expectations that transformed the relationship into a transaction where you were constantly evaluated based on how much you could satisfy her needs instead of being loved unconditionally regardless of material contributions or constant emotional availability. That perspective helped me immensely to process contradictory feelings about Helena, without falling into the trap of trying to simplify a complex relationship into a binary narrative of either she was completely bad or I was wrong to feel betrayed. Reality was much more nuanced and uncomfortable because it involved accepting that a person can simultaneously genuinely love and behave in deeply destructive ways when manipulation becomes a habitual strategy to get what she wants. Approximately 1 year after that extrajudicial agreement that had ended the fraudulent lawsuit, I received an unexpected call from Claudia, informing me that Helena had been diagnosed with a serious health problem that required significant surgery, and especially a prolonged recovery period where she would need more intensive assistance than she could manage alone living independently. My immediate reaction to that news was a complex mixture of genuine concern about Helena's physical well-being and simultaneously deep caution about not allowing a legitimate medical situation to be used as another form of emotional manipulation intended to force me to resume the previous close relationship without her having demonstrated genuine behavioral change or taken real responsibility for the devastating emotional consequences her fraudulent actions had caused. After consulting extensively with Dr. Mariana about how to navigate that situation, maintaining healthy boundaries while demonstrating appropriate human compassion for a person facing genuine medical crisis, I decided I would contribute financially to medical costs not covered by public insurance, but would not resume the role of primary caregiver that would require constant physical presence and intensive emotional involvement that could easily reactivate dysfunctional patterns I had worked so hard to dismantle. Today, 3 years after that fraudulent lawsuit that completely transformed my understanding of the nature of my maternal relationship, I maintain limited but cordial contact with Helena based on clearly established boundaries, and especially realistic acceptance that the deeply close and emotionally intimate relationship we had previously will never be recovered because it was founded on trust that was irreparably destroyed through conscious choices she made to betray me in such a devastating way. I visit her occasionally during important holidays along with Claudia and other family members in contexts where I am not the only person responsible for her emotional or financial well-being. And especially, I maintain superficial conversations focused on neutral subjects, avoiding completely discussions about finances or expectations about appropriate levels of family support that could easily reactivate underlying conflicts that were never truly resolved but merely managed through external boundaries instead of genuine internal change on her part. The most valuable lesson I learned through that traumatic experience was not simply about recognizing signs of emotional manipulation in family relationships, but especially about the fundamental importance of establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries even with people we love when their behavior demonstrates being destructive to our emotional or financial well-being, regardless of motivations they may claim to justify harmful actions. Real family love does not require sacrifice of our own dignity, financial stability, or mental health in the name of unconditional loyalty to people who demonstrate willingness to harm us when they feel their desires are not being adequately satisfied. Healthy relationships of any kind are based on mutual respect, genuine honesty, and especially refusal to use manipulation or fraud as tools to get what we want from other people. Did you enjoy Beatrice's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.